Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. In the past lecture, we did an overview of the Cold War, that long and indecisive conflict that pitted the United States and its allies of NATO against the Soviet Union and its allies of the Warsaw Pact from roughly 1946-47 all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the previous lecture, I explained that the fear of nuclear annihilation meant that the two sides never went against each other directly. And this is why we call it the Cold War. There was never a hot shooting war. This was slightly inaccurate in the sense that there were occasions where the Cold War turned hot, though in that case it meant that the United States fought an ally of the Soviet Union, say as in the war in Vietnam in the 60s, or maybe the Soviet Union would fight against an ally of the United States, which is roughly what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. One good example of that early in the Cold War would be the so-called Korean War. And I want to focus on that a bit more because my goal in this class is to show you how the world of the past influenced the world of today, and whatever is happening in communist North Korea is something that you often hear about in the news. So if you wondered how come there is a dictator that is communist in North Korea, the answer will come today. Korea used to be a single united country. People in North and South Korea are part of the same people. They speak the same language and share the same tradition. The only reason why they're split into countries is that after World War II, the country was split between Russian troops that liberated the northern part of the country and American troops in the south. And this was supposed to be kind of a temporary partition, but it happened, as in Germany, this became set in stone, and then you have the creation of two regimes that are sharply different. To the south, you had a dictatorship that was pro-American and abided by economic practices inspired by capitalism, and that would be a regime led by a man called Syngman Rhee. And to the north, you had a very different system inspired by communism, led by a man called Kim Il-sung. And it's a bit confusing. In many countries in East Asia, the last name goes first, so this would be Mr. Kim. And then he was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il, and now you have the grandson, Kim Jong-un, Kim being the last name, but it goes first. Kim Il-sung, the dictator of the North, always thought that this division ought to be temporary, and he wanted to unite the entire country underneath his own rule. Normally, that would violate the doctrine of containment. And remember from the last lecture that containment was this firm policy by the United States during the Cold War, first embraced by Harry Truman, but also followed by his successors, that the United States would allow no other country to go to the communists. Well, early in 1950, the US Secretary of State, meaning the man in charge of American foreign affairs, was Dean Acheson, and he was interviewed by some journalists about whether this or that country in East Asia was very important to US foreign policy. And he rattled off a list of countries like Taiwan, like Japan, and he kind of forgot to mention South Korea. Today would be difficult to forget because South Korea has now become a rich, important country, and probably your cell phone is made by Samsung, or maybe you're driving a Kia car. But back in the 1950s, this was a very poor country and quite unimportant, and so it's understandable that the US Secretary of State would kind of forget to mention South Korea as one country that is key to American security interests in the region. Well, Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans were paying close attention to what Dean Acheson had to say, and they figured, well, the US doesn't seem to care about South Korea, so maybe their doctrine of containment will not apply to South Korea, and we might be able to invade South Korea and get away with it. And so in June of 1950, North Korean troops crossed the border into South Korea, apparently acting kind of on their own without truly consulting Mao Zedong in China or the dictator Joseph Stalin in Russia. Interestingly, North Korea, being such a brutal dictatorship today, has a way of rewriting the history in a way that is more favorable to its leaders. And if you took a history lesson in North Korea, I don't know if they have people doing web classes over there, but if you did so, you would be taught in North Korea that actually it's the Americans who attacked first. Well, there's such a thing as truth. As a historian, what you do is go through the archives and look at the documents and weed out the forgery. So usually you're able to know what happened and what did not happen. So I can confirm to you that no, the North Koreans attacked whatever Kim Il-sung might have said. The war was a pretty complicated one where troops went up and down the peninsula on several occasions. For your convenience, I have divided it into 4 distinct phases. The first one would be the one that I just described, and that would be the communist attack in June 1950. So that would include crossing the 38th parallel, and you see on the map that's kind of a natural border between North and South Korea, taking the capital, Seoul, and then moving all the way to the second largest city in South Korea, the port of Busan in the south, and almost wiping out the entire South Korean and American presence in that area, with only a tiny bit area around Busan resisting to the communists. At this point, the US President Harry Truman had to decide whether it was worth it to send troops to defend South Korea or just to leave out the entire peninsula. And overall, the South Korean peninsula was not that important to the United States. Remember, it's still a very poor country. But it becomes a matter more of prestige. He had drawn the line in the sand, the whole issue of containment, saying no other country would go communist. And the year before, in 1949, that's exactly what had happened. That after a long local civil war, the communists had taken over in China. And ever since then, Harry Truman, who was a Democrat, had been pummeled by his Republican opponents for being soft on communism and having, quote, lost China. One of his critics would be a senator from Wisconsin, McCarthy, and we'll talk about him in the next lecture. And so Harry Truman, whose approval ratings were extremely low in the 1950s, felt that he needed to do something to show that he was tough on communism, and he would not let another country go communist on his watch. In order to justify the US entry into the conflict, Harry Truman went to the United Nations, which, as you remember, was created as part of the Yalta Agreement at the end of World War II. And that institution had not achieved much since. The way it functions is that you have a General Assembly where every country in the world is a member, and that General Assembly has pretty much no power. And then you have an executive group called the Security Council. That's the only one that's actually passing resolutions that do matter. And that Security Council has 15 members, 10 of which are rotating members, meaning every 6 months a new country gets to be on the Security Council, and 5 of them are permanent members. And these would be the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain. And by China, back then, I meant non-communist China. The remnants of China had fled to Taiwan, so it's a bit complicated. But because communist Russia was on the council, whenever there would be a resolution happening during the Cold War, while Russia would vote one way, the United States would vote the other way, and the council would be deadlocked, because those 5 permanent members have what is called veto power. If one of them says no to something, even if the other 14 countries in the council say the other thing, the resolution will be defeated. Why did it happen? In 1950, Russia was boycotting the council to protest the fact that communist China was not occupying the Chinese seat, and so for a short period of time, the 2 members that might have voted against, either communist China or communist Russia, were not on the council, and so Truman was able to get a resolution passed with the Security Council. And that resolution stated that North Korea was the aggressor and that the UN was authorizing the US and any of its allies to mount an operation to protect South Korea from communist aggression. And so that gave a lot more credibility to the action, because now it was not just the US acting on its own or South Korea acting on its own, but an international coalition fighting under the UN flag to defend the rights of nations from one particular aggressor. Still to the present time, you have US troops stationed in South Korea, and still to the present time, they do so under the UN flag. It's one of these long-running UN operations. The person in charge of pushing back the North Koreans from South Korea was General Douglas MacArthur. And we've seen him twice in the class so far, briefly during the 1932 Bonus Army episode. You remember when Herbert Hoover chased those veterans out of Washington? MacArthur was part of the people that kicked out those veterans, not his proudest moments. And we also encountered him in World War II when the United States lost the Philippines to Japan early in the war. MacArthur would have been there, and he vowed to return, and he did. And so by the end of World War II, he reconquered the Philippines on behalf of the United States. And when Japan was eventually defeated, he would be part of the US occupation forces in Japan. In fact, he drafted the constitution that is still currently the Constitution of Japan. So a very famous general in East Asia, and naturally he was put in charge of that operation. He had a very daring operation where, instead of fighting around Busan, decided to get some troops on ships and land them deep behind enemy lines around Seoul, the capital. specifically in a place called Incheon, which is not the best place to land. The coast is very rocky, you have huge tides, but luckily the enemy was not expecting American troops there, and so that landing was successful. And so Seoul, the capital, was retaken, and afraid of being trapped in the South Korean peninsula, the communist troops from the north retreated across the 38th parallel and went back into North Korea. At that point, MacArthur could have recovered South Korea and called it quit and said, well, we've achieved our mission of protecting South Korea and the war would have been over and everything would be fine. But he got a bit cocky and decided to move across the 38th parallel and not just protecting South Korea, but actually defeating North Korea, and even called about maybe moving to China as well and getting Mao Zedong, the communist dictator, out of China altogether. In fact, he got so cocky that at some point he got into a fight with Harry Truman and he got fired for that reason. But at any rate, he pushed into North Korea, and that would be part of that second phase of the war when the United States successfully counterattacked. Up to a point, because by the end of 1950, the US was getting close to the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. And China became very uncomfortable, thinking American troops are pushing closer and closer to my border, with a violently anti-communist general at its helm, Douglas MacArthur, and apparently they might try and overthrow me as well. And so after issuing a variety of threats, China entered into the conflict, and MacArthur thought, well, China is a backward country, if they enter the war, who cares, I'll just brush them aside along with the others. As it turned out, China sent a lot of troops, and they were quite valiant, and they were able to push back American troops in the winter of 1950-51, and that inaugurated the third phase of the war, where with the Chinese intervention, the Cold War got even hotter, and American troops were pushed all the way down the Korean peninsula, only stopping their retreat roughly halfway down along, you guessed it, the 38th parallel. The fourth phase of the war is a bit less exciting by comparison. It would last throughout 1951, 52, 53, and would be more described as a stalemate, where troops fought alongside the 38th parallel and none of them were able to, whether from the north or the south, to really push and defeat the enemy. So after a few years of that, there was a decision to start peace negotiations, and these were named after the place where they took place. Panmunjom, which you can see on the map, is located right alongside the 30th parallel. And these negotiations went on forever and ever and ever. One big reason being the prisoners of war issue, because as the fighting went up and down the peninsula, many American troops were captured in the north and communists in the south, and the idea was, well, whether to exchange prisoners back and forth. And as it turned out, a number of American troops who were prisoners in the north announced that they didn't want to be sent back to the United States, which sounded pretty weird to American negotiators, that why would a person from, I don't know, Topeka, Kansas, want to spend the rest of his life in Pyongyang, North Korea, instead of being sent back to Kansas. And the only explanation that American negotiators could come up with was that they had been brainwashed in captivity. If you're interested in that notion, I would recommend watching the movie The Manchurian Candidate, which is from that era. It's one of these great Hollywood classics, which is about a veteran returning from the Korean War and is supposed to be a hero, still goes into a career into politics. But as it turned out, he has been brainwashed while in captivity in North Korea, and he's more like a sleeping robot that will be awakened at some point and then will pervert the American democracy from within. And that was directly based, as you can imagine, on the experience of the soldiers who had actually been brainwashed in North Korea. While we're on the topic of movies, I would recommend also watching The Interview, which is far more recent, and it's kind of a raunchy comedy, but enough for a good couple hours. Which is based on a fictional story where James Franco would be a journalist sent to North Korea to interview the local dictator, and then he gets a mission from the CIA to actually kill the North Korean dictator. It's all fictional, but it was close enough to reality that the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, got upset about the fact that the movie was depicting his own death and tried to hack into the Sony Corporation, which was distributing the movie, and creates all sorts of mayhem and threaten American movie theaters to not release it. Successfully enough that it was never released properly. You can still see the movie. It's been released kind of a direct-to-video kind of a situation, and now it's available on streaming. I always got upset that many American movie theaters caved into the North Koreans and refused to screen the interview. So be a patriotic person, grab the popcorn and watch the interview and stick it to the North Koreans. Well, eventually the prisoner of war issue was settled somewhat, and the two countries agreed to call for a truce, TRUCE, which is a synonym to an armistice or a ceasefire. And it's not quite a peace treaty. A ceasefire simply means that you stop the fighting while waiting for a proper peace treaty to have a permanent peace. As it happened, however, no peace treaty was actually signed, so the armistice was the only thing that actually existed as a treaty. And so technically, even though the Korean War ended, the fighting itself in 1953, the two countries are still at war decades and decades after the fact. It's not just a matter of legal minutiae, because there were outbreaks of fighting, or at least tensions, across the border. That 38th parallel is one of the really hot spots of the world today, heavily fortified with troops on permanent war footing on either side of the border, including, still to the present time, dozens of thousands of American troops. And once in a while you have some battle at sea or some cross-border intrusion or something of that nature. It's really a hot war. Also, now that the Cold War has ended, Soviet Russia is no more, so you have fairly few communist countries in the world. China is still communist, but in practice they have embraced many capitalist countries, so they're not truly communist. Same thing with Vietnam, to some extent Cuba, so North Korea would be the last truly communist totalitarian dictatorship that is still there today, one of the last holdovers from the Cold War. And they are truly weird. Aside from denying the fact that it started the Korean War, there's a cult of personality where the current leader is described as being like a god who I think learned to play golf when he was like 5 years old, and the first time he hit a golf ball he got a hole-in-one, and all sorts of stupid crazy stories like that people are supposed to believe. And really some bizarre stories. I'll just give you one to give you a sense of the country. In the 1970s, there were some schoolgirls in Japan that disappeared on their way to volleyball practice after school. And the rumor was that they had been abducted by North Korean submarines and sent to North Korea. And that's the kind of story that you think, that can't be true. It's like people who claim to be abducted by aliens or something. As it turned out, that story was true, because 20, 30 years later, North Korea agreed to release those young girls, who are now women, who actually had been abducted on their way from school, taken on a submarine to North Korea, so that they could be trained as translators from Japanese into Korean and used as part of the Secret Service of North Korea. So truly a bizarre country, and we still kind of live today with it today. Their big ambition right now is to develop long-range ballistic missiles, as well as a nuclear bomb, which they have a few of, so that they can threaten other countries, including the United States, and this way get concessions out of it. Apparently, I'm tipping that in 2019, our current president is big buddy with the dictator of North Korea, so hopefully that will avert war. If not, well, that might be the last hot shooting war of the Cold War. Well, that's all I have to say about that for today. Next time, we'll leave aside the foreign shows and head back to the United States and look at the domestic repercussions of the Cold War, specifically the career of Joseph McCarthy. See you next time. Au revoir.